Hello, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we're back here today with another edition of Budget Magic, and I think we got a pretty sweet one. We are going to Standard again, keeping our streak of cheap decks for super expensive BFZ Standard intact. This one, as you can see, 41 bucks in paper, just under 15 online, so pretty cost effective. And we are playing Blue-White Tutelage. So, Sphinx's Tutelage, the namesake card, 2 and a blue. You get an enchantment. Whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2. If the cards are non-land cards that share a color, you repeat the process. And then you can pay 6 and loot, which of course triggers Tutelage again. So we've seen this card before. Andrew Cuneo played it at Pro Tour Magic Origins. We actually did a Budget Magic of it a while ago, but those decks were Turbo Mill / Turbo Fog Sphinx's Tutelage decks. The idea was to stick a Tutelage, draw as many cards as possible with Magmatic Insight and Treasure Cruise, and mill your opponent out super fast. We are exactly the opposite. Basically, in this deck, we are playing Tutelage fairly. We stick a Tutelage, we wait 10, 15, 20, 25 turns, and eventually we mill out our opponent's entire library just by drawing a card every turn, like you always do in a game of Magic. So to stay alive, we're playing a ton of enchantments and different spells to control every possible play our opponent can make. So as you can see, 0 creatures. We are all spells and lands in this deck. We have a ton of ways to deal with creatures. We have 4 copies of Silk Wrap. So 1 and a white, you get to exile a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less until Silk Wrap leaves the battlefield. Great way to deal with Jaces, Den Protectors, Death Mist Raptors, any little creatures. We have 4 pacifisms, which are basically worse Silk Wraps, usually, because they only keep a creature from attacking or blocking. So if we put this on a Jace, it can still loot, can still flip into a Planeswalker. Where pacifism is great, though, is you can throw it on a Dragon Lord and shut it down completely. You can throw it on a Thunderbreak Regent, or even an Ulamog, and you completely lock down its ability to attack. So those are our 7 2-mana removal spells. Then we also have 4 Stasis Snares, Instant Speed enchantment for 1 and 2 white, and it exiles any creature your opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So this is our one big instant speed removal spell, can take care of any problematic creature, and is just super powerful. So that's our creature removal package. Then we have a few ways to deal with Planeswalkers. We have 3 suppression bonds, so 4 mana, enchant any non-land permanent, and that permanent cannot attack or block. Okay, but the big deal is its activated abilities can't be activated. So this locks down a Planeswalker, and then also 3 copies of Quarantine Field. Another way, primarily to deal with Planeswalkers. So for 4 mana, you can exile any non-land permanent. For 6, you can exile 2. For 8, you can exile 3, and so on. Basically, it's like Super Oblivion Ring. So we have those 6 spells to deal with Planeswalkers, which means we want to try to hold those for Planeswalkers and use our pacifisms, Silk Wraps, and Stasis Snares on creatures, and just use the Suppression Bombs in Quarantine Field in a pinch to deal with a creature, but primarily to take care of those Planeswalkers. Then we also have 4 Planar Outbursts. Like we've talked about before in other Budget Magics, if you're up against a Hordling Outburst, you really can't win the game by casting 3 Silk Wraps on each individual token. You really need a way just to clean up all those creatures at once, and Planar Outburst is our way. So 5 mana destroys all non-land creatures. If you get up to 8 mana, you can also awaken a land, put 4 counters on it. So that's just our sweeper. Then we also have 1 copy of Starfield of Nyx. I can't get away from the Starfield. It just seemed too powerful in a deck with so many enchantments. But we are not a Starfield deck. Our plan isn't to beat down with enchantments which are animated by Starfield. This comes down and in the late game gets us back a Pacifism that was destroyed by a Planar Outburst. Gets us back a Silk Wrap that might have got killed by an opponent. Gets us back a Tutelage that someone destroyed. So it's just our late game trump card, I guess. Sooner or later we'll draw our 1 copy and we can get back anything our opponent may have killed. The rest of the deck, we have some interesting pieces. We have 4 copies of Ugin's Insight. Ugin's Insight's not a great card because it's sorcery speed, but we are not the typical control deck that doesn't want to tap out because it's holding up counter spells. We don't mind tapping out. So in our deck, it's fine. We can tap out on turn 5 to draw 3, usually get some scries because we have so many enchantments on the battlefield, usually at least scry for 3, sometimes 4 or 5. But this is just to make sure our hand is always filled and we always have an answer for our opponent's next threat, be it a creature or a planeswalker. It does get some more triggers for tutelage too, but we're not really trying, like I said, to turbo it out with tutelage. This is here because we need a full hand of control cards. Then we also have one Dampening Pulse. This was actually the reason I tried building the deck. I wanted to see if there was a Dampening Pulse deck. Unfortunately, Dampening Pulse isn't that great. It's very good against a very narrow set of cards, but in too many matchups, it's not very good. So we started out with 4 of them. By the time I was making videos, I was all the way down to 1, and even that might not be correct, but it isn't bad. So we got one Dampening Pulse. Citadel Siege actually is pretty important. One of our other weaknesses is haste creatures, or like Gideon turning into a creature and attacking, because we don't have that many instant speed spells, only the 4 stasis snares to deal with those creatures. Citadel Siege just sits out there on Dragon's mode, and at the beginning of combat on our opponent's turn, we get to tap down any creature. So this shuts down a Gideon or a Dragon Lord Kolaghan or whatever other hasty creature that our deck would otherwise be very bad at dealing with. Then we also have a single copy of Monastery Siege. This is just to filter through our deck. We always put it on cons, which is the loot mode. So we draw an extra card at the beginning of our draw step, then we discard a card. And it does trigger our Sphinx's Tutelage, but it's mostly there to make sure we don't just flood out and we're always hitting that action. And then finally, the one non-enchantment, non-removal spell in the deck, 2 copies of Negate. So I realized the rest of our deck, we're good at locking down creatures with Pacifism and Silk Wraps and so on. Good at locking down Planeswalkers with Quarantine Field and Suppression Bonds. Good at wiping things up with Planar Outbursts and drawing cards with Ugin's Insight. The one card that we couldn't beat was Ugin the Spirit Dragon. If Ugin comes down, it wipes away all of our enchantments, gets back all our opponent's stuff, and we just lose. We can shut it down with the Quarantine Field or Suppression Bonds after it's been out for a turn, but with Ugin that's too late because it can come down immediately minus and wipe away so much of our stuff. So Negate, we let it sit in our hand if we think there's any chance our opponent has an Ugin in their deck, and we hold it and we hold it and we hold it, and eventually we counter that Ugin to keep it from making us lose the game. It used to be worse. Before rotation, there was also Back to Nature, which had a really similar effect in just ruining our game plan, but now it's just Ugin, so Negate is there just to answer Ugin. If Ugin wasn't in Standard, we wouldn't be playing a main deck Negates. Land-wise, pretty basic. 4 Tranquil Coves, gains us a life, blue-white dual. 8 copies of Plains, 5 Islands, 4 Evolving Wilds, and 2 Blighted Cataracts. This card is really sweet. It's a colorless land, which isn't great. Costs a lot to activate, isn't great. But it's a land that draws us cards, so we can just play this, let it sit on the battlefield, and eventually, at instant speed on our opponent's turn, we can tap, sack it, draw a couple cards, make sure our hand is full of all these answers, and it also triggers Sphinx's Tutelage. So it fits really well with the theme of our deck. So again, before we talk about the sideboard, the plan is play a Tutelage, stop every single thing our opponent does for the entire game, and 15 or 20 or 25 turns later, we will mill our opponent out slowly, 2 cards at a time, with our draw step by Sphinx's Tutelage. So the sideboard-wise, I said we wouldn't play Negates if it wasn't for Ugin. We're not beyond sideboarding into a real control deck or a traditional control deck. We got 3 Dispels to deal with instants. Part of that package is 2 Negates, so we can sideboard in all these counters. Against a control deck, Pacifisms and Silk Wraps aren't that great, so we can bring these in and play a real control game, fight over Planeswalkers with Quarantine Fields and Suppression Bonds, and use our counter spells to kind of control the action. We have 2 Cranial Archives, also primarily for that matchup. It is possible with this deck to get in a position where we will mill ourselves out or draw on an empty library first. In those really grindy control matchups, Cranial Archive comes in, shuffles in our own library to make sure that even if our opponent somehow killed all of our tutelages, we still win the game by our opponent drawing on an empty library. So that's our control package. 4 Erishan Clerics. Those come in aggro matchups. Gains us 3 life, blocks a Zurgo or something. Just a great card against like Mono Red or a Tarka Red. One to end hostilities. Sometimes we want a 5th sweeper. Sometimes, if our opponent is playing a lot of awaken cards, we bring in one to end hostilities over a Planar Outburst, because Planar Outburst doesn't kill lands, even if they're awakened into creatures. Then we have 2 Orbs of Warding. Probably just a better version of Dampening Pulse. It gives us hexproof, so we don't get hit by discard, don't get hit by burn. It actually shuts down quite a few things, so it's a cool answer for that. And it also prevents 1 damage whenever a creature would deal damage to us. So it has the same effect as Dampening Pulse, giving creatures -1, -0. And then finally, a Dragonlord's Prerogative. Also, for the control matchups, just another way to draw some cards and make sure our hand's full, and this time it's at instant speed, so we can tap out for Dragonlord's Prerogative in response to our opponent tapping out for a Dig Through Time or something. So I think this deck is pretty sweet. It plays a pretty interesting game. It's a control-y game, but it does it in a different way than most control decks, and our win condition in Tutelage is fairly resilient. There's not that many popular enchantment removal spells beyond Remoquest Command. We can get it back with Starfield, and it doesn't really care what our opponent's doing. We don't have to worry about chump blockers or creature removal spells. And that's the real allure to this deck, is that we blank all those cards in our opponent's hand. So their Ruinous Pass, Ultimate Prices, all of those cards are just suddenly dead because we don't have any targets. They don't have anything to cast them, so we turn a large portion of our opponent's hand and their deck into mulligans just by the way we built the deck. So I think it's pretty sweet. I definitely had fun playing it, had reasonable success with it, and in some of the games that we lost with it, we were super close, like either losing because I misplayed, yes, imagine that, or losing games that felt very winnable if we had just drawn slightly better or ran a little bit smoother. So, I don't know, I think the deck has potential, especially for a $41 deck. You just really can't go wrong. So, I'm excited for it, and hopefully you all have a lot of fun playing it. Anyway, don't forget, check out mtggoldfish.com. Decks prices, the metagame, strategy, all my articles, supporting all the videos. Just a great site, everything you could really want for Magic the Gathering. So make sure to check that out. And I hope you enjoy the videos, and I will talk to y'all soon.